Trump campaign is now reaching voters online.
You are seeing the President of the United States. Look at the lines.
You join our movement.
A lot of President Trump supporters here.
Greatest movement in the history of our country.
President Trump stood up early on and said, let's stop the travel, save a lot of American lives.
Coronavirus outbreak has only further exposed Joe Biden's weak leadership towards a communist nation.
Because of the system we have, we've been able to ramp up and fight this virus, but that would not be there if Joe Biden were president, because he'd create Medicare for all and destroy the research and innovation that we needed in this time, in this place.
How refreshing to have a president who said, this is what I said I was going to do, so I'm going to do it.
We need to fight back. We will fight back.
We have an opportunity to fight for our freedom.
And I can tell you the president was focused, laser focused on pressing back on China.
We are one people, one family, and one glorious nation under God. We will make America great again.
Welcome to Team Trump Online.
Bienvenidos and good evening to another episode of Latinos for Trump Online. I'm joined by a very special guest, Senator Marco Rubio from the great state of Florida. Thank you, Senator, for joining us.
Buenos dias. Thank you.
Buenos dias. I know it's a very busy day. Obviously, you were just named chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Very big role in the Senate. Can you walk us through what you're going to be doing in that role?
You know, that committee's main job is just to conduct oversight over the intelligence agencies. We approve their budgets. We kind of review what they're working on, make sure their priorities are right, and work very closely with the administration. Obviously, I mean, today we're living in a world where it's about, you know, China and Russia and North Korea and Iran and terrorism. And those are the areas that we're really focused on. And then, of course, this administration, I think, has put a focus on the Western Hemisphere that we haven't seen in 20 years in terms of what Cuba's up to, in terms of what Venezuela's up to. You know, the news just yesterday that there's 5 Iranian tankers headed to Venezuela to help them out. I mean, just a reminder that our own hemisphere matters. And I can just tell you that it's not even comparable to anything Obama ever did in his 8 years in office. But you know, every administration talks about the importance of Latin America. But in my adult life, since Ronald Reagan, we haven't had a president more engaged and more involved in the Western Hemisphere than this administration. And it's been a great partnership to work with them on it.
Well, and I think one of the things we're seeing with President Trump is also his understanding not only the importance of Latin America, but understanding the global threat that China and Iran places to the United States, and the fact that China and Iran are moving resources into places like Venezuela. Walk us through a little bit about where China's role is when it comes to propping up these communist regimes.
Well, look, I think we begin by arguing what is it they ultimately want to achieve. And I think ultimately what China wants to achieve is they want to be the most powerful country in the world at our expense. And they want to be the most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere at our expense. So it's everything from trying to sell them military, including countries that are allies, to putting their companies into the economies here in Latin America. And what they ultimately do with that is that they end up having tremendous leverage on these countries. I remember just a few years ago, they tried to bully their way into gaining the fishing rights off the Bahamas. Well, that would have put them right off the coast of Florida. In Venezuela, they continue to be, they're not as open about it as Putin is, but they are actively engaged in propping up the Maduro regime. That's a country that owes the Chinese billions of dollars that they've borrowed from them. So it's tremendous leverage right on our doorstep. They are trying to have that sort of influence right on our doorstep. And, you know, thank God that if President Trump had not been elected, I think it would have been too late by the time a president would have gotten to this topic of China. And we're, you know, it's important that he be reelected for 4 more years, because if Joe Biden wins, he's not going to stand up to China.
Well, let's dig further into Joe Biden's record. Obviously, we know he's been cozy with China. He is what I would consider the ultimate career politician, a globalist who has clearly wanting to didn't even view China as a competitor, Senator. I mean, why should the American people be concerned of a Joe Biden presidency?
Well, so for 25 years around here, there's been this sort of consensus by the experts that China, once they get rich, once they start making money, they're going to become like us. And that turned out to be a terrible mistake. What they've basically done is played the country, oh, we're just a poor developing country. And in the meanwhile, they've put Americans out of work, American businesses out of work. They've made tremendous progress in becoming dominant in certain areas of technology. They're going to be key to the 21st century. Look now at the amount of masks and gowns that we depend on them. Without them, we can't even get that stuff into this country to protect our doctors and nurses. Joe Biden believes in doesn't care about any of that. He basically argues that we can work this out, that China is not really a threat. So if he's elected, I mean, it'll be the best day that Beijing has had in 5 years, because he will basically go back to that old standard operating procedure that has allowed him to make up the ground that they have on us.
Yeah, in the Senate, you were intricately involved in pointing out China's human rights abuses. Tell us about that bill and why it's important that we take action to stop China from, again, continuing to oppress those religious minorities and keep the fact that they keep taking away religious freedoms in that country.
Well, let me say there is no religious freedom in China. Even the Catholic Church is not allowed to have its own bishop. They get to name who that person is. But the most egregious case of all is the fact they've taken upwards of 1 million people, Uyghur Muslims, and put them in camps, which they call re-education camps, but really are torture places. I mean, these are places where they're stripped of their identity, separated from their families. Some cases never come out. And they're labor camps. There are companies that are actually making money by getting stuff built and made by some of this labor. So the Obama administration, when Joe Biden was there, their attitude towards these sorts of things is, well, we'll raise it in private in our meetings, but we're not going to talk about it out loud because we don't want to offend the Chinese. But I think to the great credit of this administration, they've been vocal and frontal and open. Challenged. That doesn't mean we're not going to have a relationship with China. It doesn't mean we want a war. But this needs to be confronted. It's the only thing that works is to call attention to it. And again, if Joe Biden's elected president of the United States, God forbid, you can forget about all of that. It's going to go back to the days that basically will allow them to get away with anything they want. We can't let that happen.
So we bring up this critical word. I know it's a word that I'm passionate about, and it's something that I know that you've devoted your life to as well, which is the cause of freedom. Similar to the story that my family had, your family fled oppression, fled a dictatorship. Tell us that story. Tell us how, as we now are celebrating, 20 de Mayo, which is something that as children, both of us growing up in Miami, we probably went, I went to St. Brendan. You went to Southwest?
South Miami. Yeah.
South Miami, my Lord. The ideas here of our families explaining to us why we need to commit our lives to fighting for freedom, something that President Trump does every day for America. Tell us your story.
Yeah, and let me tell you, it's not just your family, but as you know from being from South Florida, every one of our neighbors, everywhere you turn, no matter where you go in our community, it is the story of someone, not just from Cuba, but Nicaragua, and now sadly Venezuela. These were people that had lives. These were people that had plans for their future. And then a guy takes over government, Fidel Castro, and within a couple of years, your business is not yours, your property is not yours, your kids are sent to schools where they are told that Fidel is more important than God. And in fact, Fidel, if you hear your parents talk bad about Fidel, you need to report them to us. Neighbors spying on neighbors and turning each other in. The state basically wipes out religion because it wants no competition from God. People live through this. This is not something from a novel or some dystopian, movie about the future. This actually happened. It was traumatic, is the most important thing I could say about it. As you know, from our community, it is a community of people that were traumatized by this experience. And that's why they value freedom so much. That's why they value that. And so they come to this country and obviously are very grateful. They love America. And one of the things they love about America is they were able to come here and in many cases have a life of freedom that they had totally lost in their own homeland. And so when someone comes forward like a Ronald Reagan in the early 80s or a Donald Trump now, and stands so strongly on the side of people, on the side of the notion that you and I were created by God to be free government, there's those concepts of freedom that we see playing out even now with all this debate about the virus. We haven't had a more enthusiastic guardian of freedom than Donald Trump has been.
Yeah, there's no question. I think also you realize, and I say this frequently, where the democracy and our freedoms are very fragile. It can shift. I mean, when we were growing up, we didn't talk, there was no talk about socialism in America. And now socialism has become a household word because Bernie Sanders has been the fighter of socialism. You had AOC speak at the Socialist Party of America event. And guess what? That is the party. The AOC and Bernie Sanders is the party of Joe Biden. So when you look at the fact that we have seen this president fight for freedom, not only in America, but abroad, what are your concerns when you see Joe Biden in the fact that there is a sense of weakness that's coming from his personality in failing to understand the threats of socialism, the threats of communism? We saw this in particular with his ideas of reinstating the Obama-Biden Cuba policy. Yeah, so on the Cuba policy, let me just say that no administration has done what this administration has done to pressure that regime. They have gone beyond anything anyone could have ever asked for. In fact, for people like me who have a list of things that we wanted done by administrations in the past, not only has Donald Trump done all of those things, he's gone beyond it. I mean, he's gone beyond even some of the things we've asked for, and it's just an extraordinary thing to see. In terms of the overall issue of socialism, there's this misnomer out there that socialism is an economic model designed for government to help people that are in need. But socialism and freedom cannot long-term coexist. Yes. Because socialism involves the government taking over an economy because they promise you give us some of your freedom, we'll give you some prosperity and security. But when it doesn't work out, then they have to come down on you politically because they can't allow you to protest against it or complain against it. And ultimately, if you turn over economic freedom, you will end up turning over political freedom. That has been the story over and over again. Interestingly enough, when Fidel Castro took over in Cuba, he did not start out by saying he was a Marxist or a socialist. In fact, he denied he was. But the ultimate end result of a system of government in which government runs the economy is it ends up with a government running your life, telling you where you can work, what you can do for a living, how much you can make, who you have to hire. It never ends, and they need the political force to be able to put that in place. So when we're talking about socialism, it's not just an economic model, it is ultimately a political one as well. And the fact that the socialist thought process is now such a big part of the Democratic coalition, and that Joe Biden will need them to get elected, even if he doesn't believe in some of this stuff, because he will owe his success, his electoral success, that's right, to that segment of his party that's demanding it. So we know, obviously, that Biden has made it very clear that he's going to soften the sanctions on the Cuban communist regime. We know that it was that moment when President Obama met with Raul Castro and they had, hot dogs together on the baseball field and basically trying to ensure, praising Raul for the education system, the healthcare system, very similar to Bernie Sanders and his comments and praises towards this communist regime. Let's show the reality of what's Cuba today under communist rule, that it's been under communist rule for 60 years. And what does that mean for the Cuban government to be involved in propping up and sending military officials to Venezuela to destroy what was once a prosperous country? Well, first let me say that if in fact the things in Cuba were so great, the education, the healthcare, this, that, and the other, then why do so many people want to leave? If tomorrow morning you announced anyone in the country, why, in fact, it's worse than that. Why, if things were so great, why are people getting on rafts in shark-infested waters to leave that country? And the answer is because things aren't that great. Their medical system that everybody talks about is well overrated, incredibly overrated in terms of what it does. They said, which has been has cracked down on. And from an educational standpoint, it's indoctrination. They're not learning truth. The purpose of education is to learn truth. And they're not learning truth, they're learning propaganda. So that's the other point about the educational system that I would make. In terms of their support for Venezuela, if with all of these sanctions, they are still propping up the Maduro regime, imagine what they would do with billions of dollars of revenue. What they would do, they would support narco traffickers and guerrillas in Colombia. They would continue to prop up the Maduro regime, and they would be an operating base for the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and anyone else who wishes harm on the United States. I say this to you with no second thought. In Havana, the leaders of that regime are hoping that Joe Biden gets elected, not because he's a sympathizer, I'm not saying that, but because they know that if he gets elected, he will do away with all of these sanctions that this administration has put in place, and that will be a lifeline for that regime to be able to carry out this transition to the next generation of Castro-like leaders. Let's go back to Venezuela here. You've met with Juan Guaido. I had an opportunity to meet his wife when the wife came over to meet with President Trump while I was at the White House. And these are freedom fighters. These are individuals who are trying to change that society. And what you realize, I had an opportunity to meet with some of these Venezuelan university students that were kicked out because of their beliefs of freedom and of democracy and being critical of Maduro. Explain the harsh reality that's existing in Venezuela today and why the Venezuelan people are suffering so greatly under this dictator.
Yeah, it's actually apocalyptic. And what's worse about it is that the regime elites who continue to be able to traffic in dollars and steal money, they have access to anything they want. But there are people on the street in Venezuela that have no running water, no electricity. This is the richest country in the hemisphere, by the way, outside of the United States. They have no running water, no electricity, no medical care, no source of income. There's hunger. There's an entire generation of children in that country that are growing up malnourished. The impact this is going to have on that nation long term is catastrophic. And all of it, the end result of a Chavez-like socialism combined with now what's a tyranny. And this administration stands firmly on the side of freedom in that country. Let me tell you, in a traditional administration, there would have been a study and an interagency, and we need to work through, and let's talk to this guy and that guy, and it would take years to act. And this administration, it's Donald Trump saying, this is wrong, I want something done, and I want it done in like 6 hours, and it happens. And that's unprecedented, and that's what this country needs, is decisive leadership, not some long, convoluted internal study on issues, but in many cases, which are pretty clear-cut. We had to fight the Obama administration just to put simple sanctions on this president. I mean, they fought us for 2 years on sanctioning any government leader, not the economy, government leaders in Venezuela that we knew were responsible for drug trafficking. And so just think about going back to that era, because that's where I think we wind up if Joe Biden, God forbid, is elected, which he won't be.
Yeah, and I think, we also, now let's, shift gears into what we're seeing in the United States. Obviously, we are confronted with the coronavirus pandemic. The president has achieved unprecedented results in terms of helping work with the private sector, using the federal government effectively to make sure that states have what they need in terms of resources and preparedness as we're going through this pandemic together. Obviously, we have seen disruption in our economy and impacts Latino workers across the board. So what do you all, I know you all have passed the Paycheck Protection Program. Walk us through why it's so important to ensure that our American workers receive relief, also that American families are able to receive immediate relief through the CARES Act.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think is characteristic of this administration is the understanding that what makes America such a special country is not that we have rich people or big corporations, because every country in the world has rich people and most countries in the world have big corporations. What makes us unique is the everyday people who get up and go to work and raise their families and contribute to their communities, whose names we'll never know. And they're the ones that have been most impacted. And so, look, it's easy for someone on national television who's Skyping from home and is getting the country down. That's and we need to be this way for the rest of our lives or until we have a vaccine. But the fact of the matter is, and by no means am I diminishing this virus, I know people just this morning. I know someone whose grandmother just passed away. So by no means do I diminish the human suffering that's involved here. But I think there also comes a point where you have to have realistic, and that is we cannot keep people in the condition that we're in right now with the restrictions that were in place indefinitely, which is what some seem to argue. We have to try to restart our economy in the safest way possible until such time as we have a vaccine in place. And if you look at what some of the predictions were that were going to happen in this country, yes, it got pretty scary in New York for a period of time there, but ultimately we didn't see hospitals overwhelmed. We didn't see some of the more draconian or catastrophic things we saw play out in other nations. And this administration mobilized the private and civic society to respond to the crisis. We saw everyday Americans take up the charge of making masks from home and providing this, that, and the other. Was it perfect? No response to an emergency will ever be perfect. That's why it's called an emergency. But you look at the results that our doctors and nurses have achieved in terms of the death rate of those hospitalized. It surpasses all of the other top 10 countries and comparable, except for Germany, and it's very comparable with the results they had, and they don't have as many cases as we do. So I think this administration deserves a lot of credit for mobilizing the private sector to respond to this crisis in the way that it has, and as opposed to a pure government response.
And as we reopen the economy, we know that Joe Biden made it very clear what his economic policies are going to be. That's going to be, first of all, rolling back the tax cuts that President Trump put in place, meaning tax increases for the middle class And of course, his passion and obsession with the Green New Deal, which we know leads to the elimination of millions of jobs that would impact Americans. Why is that the wrong economic policy? Why is Joe Biden's approach to the economy more destructive to reopening and also to empowering our economy?
Yeah, at the end of the day, the number one objective of economic policy needs to be the economic well-being of our people. And the economic well-being of our people is best served by a job that pays a wage and is consistent, that provides you dignity. Work is not just about the money you make, it's the dignity of getting up in the morning and being able to do something productive and provide for your family in the process. In the absence of that, it's corrosive. It destroys communities and families, and it destroys the individual. And the policies that Joe Biden is pursuing and that he's advocating for are not pro-worker, are not pro-job. On the contrary, they would be devastating to work and to jobs. It is policies that basically argue that large swaths of this country are going to go on the unemployment line with the promise that some new technology will create new jobs for you somewhere else in the economy. And we've seen that that hasn't worked out with trade, and it most certainly will not work out with this. So the real world implications of some of the things he's arguing is that people who today have productive work that provides dignity and stability to their lives will see that work destroyed, will see them laid off, and it may make a lot of people at some think tank very happy that we're pursuing some idea, but it will be destructive to millions of Americans and their families. And just the election of Joe Biden alone will create some of that because of the fear and the anxiety that it will create, that that's what's coming. There's one thing is theory and the other is real life. And the theories that he has in real life will be devastating to millions of working people and disproportionate impact on Americans of Hispanic descent, on African Americans of all backgrounds.
Well, you know, we've got an election in November. What message do you want to leave our Latino voters in terms of ensuring that we can get President Trump reelected?
Two things. Number one is that there's been no president that's been more pro-work, more pro-dignity of work, pro-job than Donald Trump, and the numbers bear it out. Look at the unemployment figures before this crisis. Look at the job, small business numbers and the entrepreneurial numbers, and we hugely benefit from that. Hispanic Americans are very entrepreneurial. We're very hardworking, and this is a president that values work, that's going to put the interest of workers and jobs ahead of the interest of some, political movement or theory. And the second is, if you care about foreign policy, if you care about freedom in Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, this is the most pro-freedom president we have had since Ronald Reagan. Simple as that. And we are going to backtrack on all of that. Joe Biden gets elected president, God forbid, we're going to have a reopening and of warm relations between Washington and Havana, which will prop up a regime that's on its last legs, literally. It will be the happiest day for many in the Maduro regime, because they will know that this will mean the easing of sanctions, and it will be a lifeline to that regime. And to Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, it will also be something that he would be pleased by. Again, not because Joe Biden sympathizes with these folks, but because the policies he will put in place will serve as a lifeline that will buy those regimes more time to consolidate and strengthen their grip on power. It will be catastrophic if Donald Trump is not reelected for the cause of freedom in this hemisphere.
Well, Senator Marco Rubio, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being such a great fighter for freedom in America and across the globe. President Trump stands with the people of Venezuela, with the people of Cuba, the people of Nicaragua, and with the Latino community. And you understand how critical the Latino vote is in this upcoming election. So God bless you. God bless your family. And we appreciate all the great work that you're doing for America.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
We'll be right back, and join us for our second segment with Senior Advisor John Pence and Gianfranco Pupio Perez.
Don't listen to the fake news media. They said we had no chance in 2016, and they're saying it again now. The nation depends on you. The only way to ensure victory and keep America great is to get out and vote.
In 2016, we built an unbeatable operation that changed history. Now, we unveil our next breakthrough. The exclusive Trump 2020 app. This isn't just an app. This is your source for real news, not fake news. Straight from the campaign and the president himself. This is your direct line to give input on key campaign issues. Your portal to register voters. Host MAGA meetups. Your scheduler. Your application on becoming a Trump team leader.
Join millions and get a front row seat to our virtual events. Watch Team Trump every night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Earn points, get rewarded, Get the presidential photo. Oh, and did we mention, this is your personal shopper too? So just to repeat, this isn't just an app. This is your tool to keep America great. Join the Army for Trump and download the app today.
Had a call with 12,000 small businesses, the engine of our country, and I assured them that my administration is doing everything within its very considerable power, frankly, to support them. I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
Welcome back to Latinos for Trump Online. Now I have two very special guests joining me. Gianfranco Pupio Perez. Welcome, Gianfranco, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It is truly an honor, and I want to thank the Trump campaign for their stellar outreach to the Latino community, and it is absolutely without comparison.
Oh, wonderful. Well, and John Pence, my dear friend and senior advisor for the Trump-Pence campaign, always a pleasure to have you on the show, and I miss seeing you in the office because we've been so far apart.
I know. Thanks for having me, Mercy, and it's great to see you all.
Good. And, you know, John is married to a beautiful, beautiful friend of mine who I had the honor to work with at the White House. So please send Giovanna my love.
Will do. Thank you.
So let's dig into this. I want to, let's put our political hats on. We just had this great discussion with Senator Marco Rubio. And I always love his passion and his fight for freedom. And you all understand this clearly. Why have the Democrats gone so far to the left? Why are they embracing socialism and communism in America? John, I'll start with you.
Well, Mercy, let's not forget, just less than 6 months ago, a self-described Democratic socialist was leading the Democratic nomination for president, Bernie Sanders. This illusion of free this and free that is enticing, but we know that it is free. And when we give into socialist policies, we give away our freedom. And that's why I really believe that it's freedom versus socialism on the ballot. We need to stand with President Trump. We need to choose freedom in November. So,
Gianfranco, you're dealing with Venezuelans and Cubans in Miami. You work closely with these communities. What message you share and in telling voters, basically, and saying why socialism and communism are not the right way to go and why the Democrats continue to push these very dangerous policies in America?
Well, Mercedes, let me tell you that the truth of the matter is that my life experience, which is like that of so many others right here in our community, is a direct product of the horrors and failures of socialism. And after the rise of the brutal communist dictatorship in Cuba, my grandparents, Pablo and Purita, who were young professionals at the time with 2 toddlers, fled to Venezuela, a country that welcomed them with open arms. And my grandfather upraising the ranks of the aerospace and financial industry. My mother and my uncle graduated from college, and they were successfully able to reinvent themselves in a country that was then at the time the most prosperous in Latin America. And let's fast forward a little bit to 1999, when actually corrupt and ruthless Hugo Chavez, with his red berets and closed fist, he promised the Venezuelan people that socialism was the solution to their problem. And the problem is that it's like all these corrupt, ruthless, and socialist dictators in Latin America, Chavez that he will emulate the 61-year disaster that communist Cuba has been. And obviously followed by the obviously and unfortunately, Hugo Chavez followed the Castro-style socialism to the teeth. And unsurprisingly, Chavez began persecuting the opposition, journalists, expropriating, which, by the way, expropriating is just a fancy way of saying, to say stealing, radio and television station. And then he began stealing factories and farmland. And before you knew it, the Chavista regime started stealing bakeries and supermarkets and small mom and pop businesses, which were the backbone of my community. And unfortunately, all of this ended in institutional persecution of any and every dissenting voice and the rise of widespread crime and institutionalized violence. So unfortunately, in 2010, my family, who had fled communist Cuba in the 1960s, had no other choice but to leave our country. So in a sense, my family has lived a double exile. I guess I can say that. But there are thousands of families just like mine across our country, and especially in South Florida. And let me tell you that I'm so lucky to live in a community that has survived through the horrors of socialism and that values and appreciates the freedom and democracy that America is all about. So I have dedicated my time in the United States since the moment I arrived to this, my new home, pretty much to standing up against socialism. First as a grassroots activist, and then as an organizer, and I have been able to work with school board members, state legislators, and even members of Congress on the issues affecting the very fabric of our community. And honestly, when I hear people like Bernie Sanders applaud and congratulate and praise a brutal regime like that which forced my grandparents from their home and separating them from the people and places they love, and then when he so infamously stated that the fact that the American dream was in Venezuela, not the United States, I believe it's a slap in the face to so many families like mine across our state and our nation. Because Bernie Sanders socialism is not Sweden, it's not Norway, and it's not Denmark, but nothing more than a rat-race version of the totalitarian and cynical dictatorship we have destroyed countries like Cuba, like Venezuela, and like Nicaragua.
I first of all, thank you for sharing your story. I think it's so important. And I spend so much time talking to my own children, my girls that range from the ages of almost 17 to 8 years old, about the dangers of socialism and communism. And I worry every day when I see the indoctrination of some of these schools basically selling socialism and communism as a good thing. And I'll tell you, I always tell my girls the story of my father, who was a political prisoner in Cuba, suffered under the Cuban regime, was tortured. And when he came to America, rebuilt his life, never took a handout from the government. And I remember in 2016, when President Trump came down the escalator, said, he's my guy and I'm voting for President Trump, because he knew that President Trump would stand strong against these communists. And I have to tell you, he really has been that president who we see huge results coming, which we've seen the president understanding the plight of the Cuban people, understanding the plight of the Venezuelan people as well. John, why is it critical that we have President Trump stay in office for this upcoming election in order to ensure that we don't move this country into a socialist state?
Well, fast forward from the escalator to the State of the Union. President Trump said at the State of the Union just about 2 years ago, America will never be a socialist country. President Trump is standing up for freedom at home and abroad. And by doing that, we are securing the American dream for future generations. When I go out on the road and speak with new volunteers, many of which from the Latino community, we talk about why the Republican Party is the party of freedom. We stand up for freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom for the unborn, freedom of commerce if it's free, fair, and reciprocal trade. And they're taking notice that President Trump is standing up for our freedoms by putting America first. And that is a message we're taking to every community, to every American of every corner of this country. And it's why President Trump needs 4 more years to lead our nation.
Gianfranco, what are you doing in order to ensure that our younger generation understands the dangers of socialism? And why, I know everyone, what I find interesting, the Democrats, they think that since Bernie Sanders is no longer the presidential nominee, they're like, oh, we shouldn't even talk about socialism as an issue. I think we need to keep talking about socialism as an issue because it exists, and they're selling it to the younger generation. So what steps are you taking to ensure that we're able to get this message out to younger generations?
Look, I was a teenager when I first arrived to the United States in 2010, and I moved into Doral, which is the largest Venezuelan community in the nation, where there are thousands of stories just like mine, of tears, of loss, of suffering, and separation from people and places that we love. But in many places, in many ways, we are also immensely lucky, because we live in America where there is no limit to where hard work, perseverance, and dedication can take you. And let me tell you a little fun fact. Our local school in Doral is named after none other than Ronald Reagan himself. And while I have studied Reagan back in Venezuela, I became immediately curious to learn more about the man that my new school was named after. And I read countless of books and watched dozens of documentaries, films, audio recordings of Reagan, and I was instantly fascinated by a man who rose from a working class background in the to becoming one of the Hollywood's most famous stars, to becoming governor of California and then president of the United States. And President Reagan has inspired me in a way that it's even hard for me to describe. Whether it was getting communist guerrillas out of the jungles of Nicaragua and Grenada, or nominating one of my heroes, I think is Armando Valladares, who actually was a Cuban exile and political prisoner, who spent 22 years rotting in Castro gulags. Reagan nominated him to the United Nations Commission of Human Rights. And pretty much Reagan was a leader who fought for the young people like me. And as a college student, I'm terrified when I see colleagues and classmates suggesting that socialism and communism are superior to capitalism. And anyone who actually lived through socialism knows just how horrible it is. And in fact, this past year, as a separate note aside, I did two significant, highly gratifying things. That one of them is that I was able to visit the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. And the second one was that I was able to attend the Turning Point USA Summit in Palm Beach with a group of very recently arrived refugees from Venezuela, young kids and college students who got the opportunity to meet so many of our nation's leaders. President Trump speaks so clearly about the horrors occurring in Cuba and Venezuela. And I almost even tear up when I saw these young exiles interact with young college students from across our country and share their experience with them. And let me tell you that many of the American college students were in absolute disbelief when listening to the stories, our stories, about what socialism has done to our country. And we need more and more opportunities like this one for Venezuelan, Cuban, and Nicaraguan students to share their actual experience under socialism with their counterparts across America. And honestly, in Florida, this past session, our legislature passed a bipartisan bill that actually inserted Holocaust and African American history education in our public school. And right now, I think that the very exact same thing should be done to teach students about the horrors of socialism and communism in our public schools. Like the dangers of an absurd ideology that has killed over 100 million people can never be overlooked, especially in states like Florida, with millions of victims from socialism on Cuba and Venezuela. And our community is motivated because President Trump has declared time and time again, like John said, that America will never be a socialist country, and that will only never happen. We just need to vote massively to re-elect President Trump this November. And not only teach the young people, we also need to teach the older people as well. They're actually coming here as immigrants to this country, our country.
That's a great point. And I think it's so important to say, when you all are out there talking to your neighbors, talking to your friends, John, I know you've traveled so much across the country. It is so important to tell them you're 2 steps away from communism when you're embracing socialism. You're 2 steps away from getting your freedoms taken away. And that's how so many people feel. And the left really has no problem going in that direction. They have no problem going after people who have, faith, and they have no problem in trying to insert their own beliefs and say government should be the one that's going to solve all your problems, not you, the individual, the God-loving individual. No, it is for them, government is the solution. And I think that that's very troubling. And I think for Latino voters, it's so critical that we be that voice to share our stories and to say, look, we go in this direction of socialism in America, and these young people think that it's the greatest idea. And you're going to say, you're going to be stuck in your couch, sitting on your couch like you did during the Obama years, in your parents' basement. And where are the opportunities? Where is the innovation? America's the last hope. We're the last stands for freedom. And if we fall, the world falls. And it's why President Trump's leadership is so critical to ensure that America's freedoms continue to be an example across the globe. Over to you, John. We know that Joe Biden has been obviously very cozy with China. He's not one to stand too strong against China. In fact, I think he kind of likes being this great globalist. And I think that that's a position that I think is very threatening to the United States. Walk us through why Joe Biden would be one who would repeatedly choose communism over freedom in the Oval Office.
Mercy, you know I've been using my broken Spanish. I'm not Latino, but I've been talking about for over a year in Spanish about America primero no significa America sola, that America first doesn't mean America alone. When we help ourselves first, we're best positioned to help others. And President Trump has shown that, especially in this time of us working together to defeat this virus. America came together, public, private, government, to produce over 100,000 ventilators. We're now in a position to help over 60 countries, sending them ventilators. And we've ensured that no American that needed a ventilator didn't have a ventilator. It shows that this America First agenda, to put America first, isn't just good for our people, it's good for the world. President Trump is doing that every day. If Joe Biden is elected, one, he never would have halted funding to the World Health Organization. He didn't put America first during his career as a career politician. That was wrong for America. President Trump is doing the exact opposite, and it's why we need to elect President Trump for 4 more years.
Well, I want to just say let's do a quick round robin here in terms of your final thoughts. We want to send a strong message to our Latino voters, the importance of them getting involved in this race, not having their voices silenced. Gianfranco, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, very modestly, I think that it is unquestionable that President Donald Trump has done more for Cuba and more for Venezuela than any president in history. While President Barack Obama and Joe Biden so pathetically did the wave at a baseball game with a murderer like Raul Castro in Havana, President Trump came right here to our communities to announce some of the most sweeping sanctions against the dictatorship that continues to oppress by denying U.S. visas or by simply implementing the law that President Barack Obama and Joe Biden chose to ignore. What a concept, right? And honestly, in the case of Venezuela, my homeland country, President Trump and this administration made the United States the very first country to recognize the constitutional and legitimate government of Venezuela led by President Juan Guaido. Instead of turning a blind eye to the countless human rights abuses and suffering perpetrated by the Maduro regime and the Chavez regime over the years against the Venezuelan people, the way that Barack Obama and Joe Biden so disgustingly did it. And President Trump has welcomed members of democratic and peaceful Venezuelan opposition with open arms to the White House, and historic, but also shows the compassion, humanity, and deep appreciation that President Trump has for the Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan community across the nation. And also, I want to thank you, Mercedes, pretty much, thank you, Mercedes, because you capture what our community is all about, and you make us proud each and every day. You're truly a role model for so many of us, and you honor our community by working day in and day out to re-elect our president. And John, muchas gracias por tu compromiso con nuestra comunidad y por divulgar las verdades sobre los horrores del socialismo a lo largo y ancho de esta nación. And as you all know, one day like tomorrow, Cuba was born as an independent republic on the 20th of May, el 20 de mayo of 1902. And believe it or not, America played a critical role in the struggles for Cuba's freedom. America provided safe haven for Cubans fleeing Spanish tyranny in Key West, and in Key West, Tampa, and community created by these brave men and women who dedicated their lives to liberating their homeland. And our national hero and patriot, Jose Marti, lived many years in the United States and rallied people from all walks of life behind the Cuban cause. Because even the Cuban flag and the national anthem were conceived in the United States. And so we must never forget our commitment to our brothers and sisters just 90 miles away who are fighting for the rights to have the things that we so often take for granted, like things like freedom, democracy, freedom of speech, and their rights to be the authors for our own destinies. And President Trump and this administration respects the Cuban American and the Venezuelan exile community. He has included us in his government. So I just leave this with this final thought. If you want a socialist apologist and you want socialism in this country, then you can go ahead and vote for Joe Biden, someone who prefers to stand with Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the socialist squads. But I'd say that if you want to support someone who has stood time to time again for freedom and human dignity around the globe, then I implore you to vote for President Trump, and not only him, but Republicans up and down the ballot this November, because our community is terrified of a Joe Biden presidency. He has stated himself that he will roll back the clock and follow the failed Obama-Biden policy of cuddling up to the disgusting regimes in Cuba and Venezuela. And right now, at this moment, the Castro and Maduro dictatorships are on their knees. And we need 4 more years of this administration to finish them off, once and for all. This is no time to waste. I think that this is a time for action.
Excellent. John, I don't know how you're going to beat that. So you could give it a try, but seriously, Gianfranco brought me to tears, and I'm very touched by what you've said. You know, for me, it's a great honor to have worked for this president and really be a voice for the campaign and for all the great work that he's doing. So John, last word.
How can you help this president? How can you help Republicans? A great way is to download the new Trump 2020 app. On the Engage tab, it shows how we can make calls together. You can make calls in English and Spanish. We made over 10 million calls just this past week. Volunteers across the country. I joined folks in Florida, Latinos for Trump in Wisconsin, who made calls in Spanish. I encourage you to get involved by visiting armyfortrump.com or downloading the Trump app, and it will help us secure 4 more years and stand up for freedom, as Gianfranco perfectly said. So thank you all so much, and check out the app.
Thank you, John. And I had to say, I love both of you. This was so great and wonderful and so inspiring. And I think it all reminds us of how you all out there, as John said, need to get involved. This is a fight of our life. This is an opportunity to be part of a big, bold movement, that of joining the Trump-Pence campaign. We can do this by the Trump 2020 app. You can also go to armyfortrump.com to volunteer, or you can text. You can actually pick up your phone, if I can find my phone here, and put VAMOS at 88022. 88022. Text VAMOS. Join our cause. Be one of the loud, strong, powerful Latino voices out there who will stand for Trump. And I know there's so many folks out there who support this president. And so I want to thank you all, mil gracias, from the bottom of my heart, for joining us tonight and joining us for Latinos for Trump with Senator Rubio, John Pence, and Gianfranco Bupio Perez. Your story was remarkable, and it just reminds us of the fight ahead and that we have to make sure that President Trump wins in November. God bless you all. God bless America. God bless President Trump. Thank you all. Buenas noches.